the dusty archives of the Santa Catalina convent in Lima, there exists a document that should never have seen the light of day. The nuns who guarded it for 3 centuries called it the cursed paper. Written in ink that resembles dried blood, it tells how a woman from Lima's highest aristocracy managed to completely destroy the viceroyalty's most powerful family, using only her womb as a weapon. What began as a love scandal turned into the most calculated and ruthless revenge that colonial Lima had ever witnessed. But to understand how Catalina de Villanueva, Marchioness of Alcantara, managed to completely annihilate the Santander family in just 2 years, we must first understand the power this family wielded and the price they were willing to pay to maintain it. Before we dive into this story that forever changed the destiny of Lima's aristocracy, I'd love to get to know you better. If these types of historical tales fascinate you as much as they do me, subscribe to the channel and activate the bell so you don't miss a single mystery. Give this video a like if you want more stories like this one, and tell us in the comments which country and city you're listening to us from. It's incredible to know that our stories reach so many corners of the Hispanic world. Now let's delve into the dark secrets of colonial Lima and discover how a desperate woman became the aristocracy's most feared nightmare. Lima, in the year of grace 1721, was the beating heart of Spain's richest viceroyalty. The cobblestone streets of the historic center echoed with the clinking of Potosi silver coins, while the carved wooden balconies hid the most sordid secrets of the Creole aristocracy behind their jealousy shutters. It was a city where power was measured not only in encomiendas and noble titles, but in the purity of the blood that ran through one's veins and the ability to keep up appearances before an all-seeing, all-judging society. At the heart of this intricate social landscape, 2 families dominated the political and economic scene with an iron fist. The Santanders, who arrived in Peru in the early years of the conquest, had built an empire based on silver mines, sugarcane plantations, and above all, a network of influence that stretched from the halls of the viceregal palace to the confessionals of the city's most important churches. Don Rodrigo de Santander, patriarch of the family, not only held the title of Count of Huancavelica, but had also managed to place his sons in key positions. The eldest, Don Fernando, was a judge of the royal court. The second, Don Carlos, held the position of corregidor of Lima, and the youngest, Don Diego, had taken the vows and emerged as one of the most influential canons of the cathedral. Facing this family colossus stood the elegant and seemingly fragile figure of Doña Catalina de Villanueva, Marchioness of Alcantara. Widowed at the age of 25, she had inherited not only her late husband's noble title, but also one of the most considerable fortunes in the viceroyalty. Her property stretched from the coastal valleys to the Andean puñas, and her ships traded from Acapulco to Valparaiso. But what truly distinguished Catalina on the Lima social scene was her legendary beauty and her privileged business mind, a combination that had made her both the most coveted and the most feared woman in high society. The rivalry between the 2 families had begun years before, when the late Marquis of Alcantara had managed to wrest the most lucrative concession in the port of Callao from the Santander family. Since then, every business move, every marriage alliance, every political decision had become a game of chess, with both houses vying for every advantage with the ferocity of gladiators in the Roman Colosseum. The Villanueva mansion, located on the corner of Pueblo and Santa Teresa streets, was an architectural marvel that reflected the power of its owners. Its adobe and brick walls rose imposingly toward the gray Lima sky, while its cedar wood balconies, carved by the finest indigenous artisans, extended over the street like protective arms embracing the secrets within. The main courtyard, surrounded by marble columns specially brought from Carrara, housed a bronze fountain where the water fell with a constant murmur that drowned out indiscreet conversations. But it was in the backyards where the true life of the mansion took place. There, among the servants' quarters and the smoky kitchens, lived and worked a population of more than 40 slaves, brought from different regions of Africa. Each one had a specific role in the complex domestic machinery, from the black cooks who prepared Lima's most exquisite banquets, to the stable boys who cared for the Andalusian-bred horses that made the Marchioness so proud. Among all these servants, Tomas stood out. a man in his 30s whose personal story had become legendary among the servants. Born in the kingdoms of Angola, he had arrived in Lima as a teenager on one of the slave ships that regularly arrived in Callao. His imposing stature, which was over 6 feet tall, and his athletic build had initially destined him for the hardest jobs on the hacienda. However, his natural intelligence and ability to quickly learn Spanish had caught the attention of the former Marquis, who decided to train him as a personal butler. Tomas possessed one characteristic that distinguished him from all the other slaves in the house: he could read and write. This skill, secretly taught by a Jesuit priest during his early years in Lima, had made him the Marquis's confidant and trusted administrator. He kept the household accounts, oversaw purchases at the Plaza Mayor market, and ensured that every detail of domestic life ran with the precision of a Swiss watch. The relationship between Catalina and Tomas had evolved over the years, from mutual respect to something much more complex and dangerous. She had found in him not only an efficient administrator, but a man whose conversations stimulated her intellectually in a way she had never experienced with any gentleman of his social class. He, for his part, had developed feelings for her that went far beyond the respect due to a mistress. He admired her, protected her, and secretly loved her with an intensity that consumed him day and night. In a society where interracial relationships were not only prohibited but punishable by death, for years the two had engaged in a subtle dance of furtive glances, conversations laden with double meanings, and seemingly casual contacts that ignited fires neither dared to openly fuel. Life in Lima followed its seasonal rhythms marked by religious festivals and social events. Mornings began with the ringing of bells calling for Alba Mass, while afternoons stretched into social gatherings where high society ladies embroidered while mercilessly criticizing their absent partners. Men gathered in the portals of the Plaza Mayor to discuss business and politics, always under the watchful eye of the vice-regal spies who reported any suspicious conversations directly to the government palace. In this atmosphere of apparent colonial tranquility, where each day passed according to the established norms of 3 centuries of Spanish domination, very few could imagine that a storm was brewing that would shake Lima society to its very foundations. A storm that would begin in the womb of a Marchioness and end up burying the Viceroyalty's most powerful surname forever. The night of March 15, 1721 was forever etched in Catalina de Villanueva's memory as the moment her world split in two. The torrential rains that had lashed Lima all week had turned the streets into impassable mud holes, and the wind that came down from the Andes whistled between the roof tiles of the houses like an ancestral lament. It was one of those nights when even the bravest preferred to take refuge behind the protective walls of their homes, leaving the empty streets at the mercy of the storm. Catalina was in her private study, located on the 2nd floor of the mansion, reviewing the account books of her estates by the flickering light of a silver candelabra. Her fingers turned the pages with the dexterity of someone accustomed to handling complex figures, while her green eyes scanned columns of numbers representing entire fortunes. It was past midnight, but sleep denied her once again, as it had for the past few weeks. A sudden dizziness forced her to stop. The room seemed to spin slowly around her, and a metallic taste invaded her mouth. She carefully rose from her carved walnut chair, but the movement only intensified the feeling of nausea she had been experiencing intermittently for the past few days. Her legs weakened, and she had to brace herself against the desk to keep from falling. "It can't be," she muttered to herself as her privileged mind began to connect symptoms she had been deliberately ignoring: the morning sickness, the sensitivity to certain smells, the strange fatigue that had been plaguing her, and above all, the absence of her monthly bleeding, which had already been missed for 2 consecutive days. With trembling hands, she walked to the gold-framed mirror hanging on the opposite wall. Her reflection returned the image of a 32-year-old woman in the prime of her beauty. But now she could perceive the subtle changes her body had been undergoing. Her breasts were slightly fuller, her skin had a different glow, and above all, that expression in her eyes that mixed terror and confirmation of her worst suspicions. The sound of cautious footsteps in the hallway brought her out of her reverie. She immediately recognized the pattern of that footstep. It was Tomas, who had the habit of making nightly rounds of the house to ensure everything was in order. Over the past few months, these inspections had become secret meetings where the two could speak freely, away from the prying ears of the servants. "Lady Marchioness," his deep voice whispered from the other side of the door, "you are fine. I saw a light in your study." Catherine closed her eyes and took a deep breath before answering. She knew that the moment she opened that door, there would be no turning back. Her life as she knew it was doomed to change forever. "Come in, Tomas. I need to speak with you." He slipped silently into the room, carefully closing the door behind him. In the golden candlelight, his dark skin looked like it had been carved from polished ebony, and his intelligent eyes immediately reflected concern when he saw the extreme pallor of Catherine's face. "What is it, my lady? You look as if you've seen a ghost." The devant words tumbled from Catherine's lips before she could stop them. "I am pregnant, Tomas, and you are the father." The silence that followed this revelation was so thick it seemed to fill the entire room. Tomas stood motionless, as if struck by lightning as he processed the devastating implications of what he had just heard. His powerful hands clenched into fists, not out of anger, but from the immediate understanding of the abyss that yawned before them both. In the colonial Lima of 1721, there was no crime more serious than carnal union between a woman of the Spanish aristocracy and an African slave. The viceregal laws clearly established that such a transgression was punishable by the immediate death of the man and the perpetual confinement of the woman in a strictly cloistered convent. But beyond the legal consequences, there was the devastating social scandal that would destroy not only Catalina's reputation but also the future of all her properties and the fate of the hundreds of people who depended on her financially. "My God," Tomas murmured, slowly approaching her. "Are you completely sure?" Catalina nodded, as tears began to roll down her cheeks. "All the signs are there. My body doesn't lie to me." "Tomas, I am carrying your child in my womb." Tomas's reaction surprised her. Instead of the panic she had expected, she saw in his eyes something completely different. A mix of tenderness, determination, and something that could be described as paternal pride. He approached until he was a few steps away from her, respecting the physical distance but bridging the emotional gap that separated them. "Then we'll flee," he said firmly. "Tonight I know paths through the mountains that will take us to territory where Spanish law has no power. We can disappear, change our name, start a new life. But..." Catalina shook her head slowly. Her mind, ever calculating, had already analyzed all possible options during the minutes of silence that had preceded this conversation. "It wouldn't work, my dear Tomas. We're too well known, too visible. Besides, what would we live on? All my money is tied up in properties that I can't sell without raising suspicion. And you're still legally my property. Anyone who saw us together would immediately know something was not right." The conversation was interrupted by the distant sound of horse hooves approaching along the cobblestone street. They both tensed immediately, as nighttime visits in colonial Lima almost always meant trouble. Tomas cautiously approached the window and slightly opened the velvet curtains to observe. "It's the Viceregal Guard," he whispered urgently. 3 horsemen had stopped in front of the Santander house. Catalina joined him at the window, and together they watched as the soldiers dismounted their horses and banged loudly on the front door of the rival mansion. Even from a distance, they could hear the raised voices and the echo of military orders that resonated in the damp night. "Something serious is happening," Catalina murmured. "The guard doesn't go out at this hour unless it's a matter of extreme importance." As if fate had decided to accelerate events, one of the soldiers broke away from the group and headed toward the Villanueva mansion. His footsteps echoed on the cobblestones with the martial rhythm that characterized the viceregal infantry. "You must leave, Tomas. Now," Catalina whispered urgently. "If they find us together at this hour in my private study, there will be no explanation that will save us." But before Tomas could move, the sound of fists pounding on the mansion's front door resonated throughout the house. It was the kind of authoritarian knock that brooked no delay or excuses. "Open in the name of the Viceroy. We have orders to speak with the Marchioness of Alcantara." Catalina and Tomas looked at each other with a mixture of terror and determination. They both knew this moment would change everything, but neither could have imagined the extent to which this night would mark the beginning of a revenge that would shake the foundations of Lima society. "Go up the back stairs," Catalina whispered. "Make sure they see you in the servants' quarters." I'll go down to greet the guard." As Tomas silently disappeared through the back door of the study, Catalina quickly composed herself in front of the mirror, put a silk robe over her nightgown, and headed for the main staircase. With each step she took toward the ground floor, she could feel the weight of her secret growing in her belly and the future she had known fading forever into the stormy Lima night. What Catalina didn't know was that the visit from the Vicerigil guard had nothing to do with her personal situation. The news she was about to receive would give her the information she needed to turn her despair into the most powerful weapon she had ever wielded. The captain of the Vicerigil guard, who was waiting in the vestibule of the Villanueva mansion, was a man hardened by years of service in the most dangerous provinces of the viceroyalty. His mud-stained leather boots and rain-soaked uniform contrasted dramatically with the elegance of the entrance hall where she waited, lit by silver candelabras that cast dancing shadows on the Flemish tapestries that adorned the walls. "Madam Marchioness," he said in a grave voice as he removed his wide-brimmed hat in a military bow. "I deeply regret disturbing your rest at this untimely hour, but I bring news of extreme gravity that requires your immediate attention." Catalina descended the main staircase with the composure that only years of aristocratic training could provide. Despite the emotional storm raging within her, her face reflected only the serene dignity of a marchioness who receives official visitors regardless of the time. "Captain Mendizabal," she responded, recognizing the officer. "I hope this news justifies this nocturnal intrusion, but matter of such urgency requires the presence of the Viceregal Guard in the residential neighborhood of Lima." The captain cleared his throat nervously before continuing. It was evident that the words he was about to speak were difficult for him, not only because of their content, but because of the political implications they carried. "I'm afraid I must inform you about an incident that occurred tonight at the convent of Santa Rosa de Viterbo, an incident that directly involves members of the Santander family." Catalina's eyes immediately sharpened. Any news related to her family rivals piqued her interest. But the mention of the most exclusive convent in Lima, where only the daughters of the most powerful families took the vows, added an element of intrigue she couldn't ignore. "Go on, Captain. What kind of incident?" At approximately 11 p.m., the nuns reported violent disturbances in the cell of Sister Maria Inmaculada de los Dolores. When the sisters managed to force their way in, they found the nun in a state of great agitation, shouting accusations against her own family. Catalina knew Sister Maria Inmaculada's identity perfectly well. It was Esperanza de Santander, the youngest daughter of Don Rodrigo, who had entered the convent just 2 years earlier under circumstances that all of Lima had considered suspicious. A beautiful and vivacious 18-year-old girl didn't usually choose voluntarily monastic life unless there were compelling reasons to do so. "What kind of accusations, Captain?" The officer glanced nervously to the sides before continuing, as if afraid that the walls themselves might have prying ears. "The nun claims that she was forced to take the vows to hide a family scandal. According to her statements, she was repeatedly raped by her own brother, Don Carlos de Santander, and when she became pregnant, the family confined her to the convent to avoid scandal." The captain's words struck Catalina like a ray of light, suddenly illuminating a landscape that had always remained in shadows. For years, she had suspected that something dark lay behind Santander's sudden, hopeful decision to abandon Lima's social life to lock herself away in a convent. Now the pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fit together in a way that revealed the true nature of the family she considered her main rivals. "Where is the sister now?" she asked in a carefully controlled voice. "She has been transferred under discreet custody to the private quarters of the Mother Superior while the Holy Office decides how to proceed. Incest accusations are matters that require investigation by the Inquisition." Catalina nodded slowly, processing the implications of what she had just heard. The Lima Inquisition, although less severe than its European counterpart, was still a fearsome force in colonial society. A formal investigation into accusations of incest could completely destroy the Santander's reputation, regardless of the ultimate outcome. Members of the Santander family have been informed of these revelations. Count Don Rodrigo and his sons have been notified and are being questioned at their respective residences. However, I must warn you, Madam Marchioness, that your name has come up during the nun's statements. This revelation made Catalina feel a chill that had nothing to do with the humidity of the Lima night. My name? In what context? According to Sister Maria Immaculada, you are the only person in Lima who showed genuine concern for her well-being prior to her entry into the convent. The nun has specifically requested that you be called as a character witness in any formal procedure that could be initiated. Catherine's heart began to beat with a force that threatened to stifle the turmoil growing within her. At that moment, as she stood in the entrance hall of her mansion listening to the captain of the guard, her privileged mind began to draw the outlines of a strategy that would turn her personal despair into the perfect weapon to destroy her enemies. Carl covered her mouth on the strength of his impulse to yell, crack the ceiling, warp the... Naturally, I will be available to testify on any aspect that may be useful to clarify the truth, she replied with the calm voice of someone fulfilling their civic duty. When do they require my presence? The tribunal of the Holy Office will meet the day after tomorrow to determine if there is sufficient evidence to proceed with a formal preliminary investigation. Your testimony would be required at that session. After the captain left in the damp dawn, Catherine remained standing in the entrance hall for long minutes while her mind worked feverishly, connecting possibilities that only hours before would have seemed impossible. The scandal of her pregnancy, which moments before had seemed an inexorable doom, now revealed itself as a unique opportunity to achieve what years of commercial and political maneuvering had failed to achieve: the complete destruction of the Santander family. She slowly went up to her study, where she found Tomas waiting for her with an anxious expression. He had heard the comings and goings of the viceregal guard from the servants' quarters, and concern for Catalina's safety had been his only concern during the entire hour that the official visit had lasted. "What did the soldiers want?" he asked as soon as she entered the room. Catalina closed the door behind her and went to the window, from where she could observe the Santander mansion across the street. Lights were still on in several rooms, and occasionally she could make out silhouettes moving behind the curtains, a sign that the family was experiencing a night as turbulent as her own. "Tomas," she said slowly without taking her eyes off the rival house, "what do you know about Esperanza de Santander? Do you remember the circumstances of her entry into the convent?" Tomas approached until he was standing next to her at the window. His memory, trained by years of observing and remembering everything that might be useful to her lady's business, she began to piece together the events of 2 years prior. "I remember it was very sudden," he said thoughtfully. "One week she was participating in all the social events of the season, including the season's ball at the viceregal palace, and the next she had already taken the vows. Rumors in the market said she had had a religious vision, but the servants of Casa Santander told a different story in the pulperias." "What kind of story?" "They spoke of screams in the night, a doctor who visited the house with unusual frequency, and carriages arriving and departing at odd hours. They also mentioned that Don Carlos, the second son, had begun drinking heavily around that very time." Catalina nodded slowly. The details Tomas remembered were beginning to paint a picture that confirmed the accusations she had heard that night, but more importantly, they provided the framework she needed for the plan that was taking shape in her mind. "More?" she said finally, turning to look at him directly. "What I'm about to tell you will sound like the fantasy of a desperate woman, but I assure you that every word is calculated with mathematical precision." She walked over to her desk and picked up a quill pen and a silver inkwell. With determined movements, she began to write on a sheet of vellum paper she reserved for important correspondence. "I'm going to tell you exactly how we are going to use my pregnancy to completely destroy the Santander family, and how at the end of this process your child will be born not as a doomed bastard, but as the legitimate heir to one of the greatest fortunes in the viceroyalty." Tomas watched her write with a mixture of fascination and terror, understanding that the woman he loved was about to become something far more dangerous than he had ever imagined. As the black ink glided across the white paper in the golden candlelight, Catalina began to explain the details of a revenge so intricate and devastating that it would forever change the balance of power in Lima society. Neither of them could have foreseen that the events they were about to set in motion would have consequences far beyond their original intentions, creating a chain of tragedies that would haunt Lima for generations. The days following Santander's testimony of hope at the convent passed in Lima like the tense calm that precedes major earthquakes. Catalina had requested a private audience with the Inquisitor General, Fray Bernardino de Mendoza, not coincidentally a distant cousin of the Santanders, which added an additional layer of complexity to their plans. The meeting would take place in the austere chambers of the Holy Office Tribunal, located in the basement of the Santo Domingo convent. On the morning of the meeting, Catalina dressed with special care. She chose a strict mourning dress, black silk with long sleeves and a high collar, which not only projected the image of a devout widow, but also perfectly concealed the subtle changes her body had begun to experience. A black lace veil partially covered her face, creating an aura of mystery and sorrow that perfectly complemented the role she was about to play. Tomas escorted her to the convent gates, officially in his role as steward, but in reality to provide her with the emotional support she would need to execute the first phase of her plan. Before descending from the carriage, she discreetly squeezed his hand. "Remember," she whispered, "everything that happens from now on is designed to protect both of us and our child. Trust me, no matter how strange my actions may seem." The Inquisitor General's quarters were as austere as one would expect from a man who had dedicated his life to the persecution of heresy and immorality. The stone walls were devoid of decoration, save for a life-size wooden crucifix that dominated the main wall and a dark oak table stacked with documents and theological treatises. Brother Bernardino, a man in his 60s with a gray beard and piercing eyes, greeted Catherine with the courteous coolness he reserved for official business. "Madame Marquise," he said without rising from his chair, "I appreciate you responding so promptly to our request. As you surely understand, the accusations that have arisen require the most careful investigation." Catherine sat down on the wooden chair indicated to her, placing her gloved hands in her lap in a posture of apparent humility. "Father Inquisitor, it is my Christian duty to contribute to the clarification of the truth, no matter how painful it may be for the families involved. It is precisely on this point that I wish to consult you," the friar continued, opening a file of documents. "According to the records we have reviewed, you maintained a friendly relationship with the young Esperanza de Santander before her entry into the convent. Could you describe the nature of that relationship?" Catalina had meticulously prepared every word of her response during the previous nights. Her strategy depended on constructing, step by step, an edifice of half-truths that would be impossible to refute. Esperanza was a young woman of remarkable intelligence and sensitivity. She began with a gentle voice. She frequently participated in the literary gatherings I organized at my house, where we discussed the works of Saint Teresa of Avila and other mystics of the Church. It was evident that she possessed a deep religious inclination. "Did you observe any change in her behavior during the months prior to her entry into the convent?" "Father, what I observed caused me such concern that I even consulted with my confessor about whether I should intervene in some way." This answer caused the Inquisitor to look up abruptly from her documents. The implications of what Catherine had just suggested were serious enough to alter the entire course of the investigation. "What kind of changes did you observe?" Catherine looked down at her hands, as if she found it painful to recall what she was about to relate. Esperanza began arriving at my gatherings with bruises that she tried to conceal with powders and oils. When I discreetly asked her about her origins, she simply said that she had suffered accidental falls. However, Father, I myself suffered during my youth from the excesses of an overly strict tutor and immediately recognized the signs. The room fell into such a profound silence that the only audible sound was the scratching of the scribe's quill pen as he recorded each word of the testament. Fra Bernardino leaned forward, his penetrating eyes boring into Catherine's veiled face. "Are you suggesting that the young woman was being physically abused?" "Not just physically, Father." Catherine replied in a voice barely audible but perfectly calculated, so that each word reached the Inquisitor's ears clearly. "On one occasion, she came to my house in such a state of agitation that I couldn't help but ask her directly what was ailing her, which she confessed to me through tears." Catalina paused, holding a lace handkerchief to her eyes as if she needed a moment to compose herself. "She confided that her brother Carlos visited her bedroom at night?" and that when she tried to resist, he beat her until she gave in to his demands. She told me that she had tried to seek help from her father, but that Don Rodrigo had simply ordered her not to repeat fantasies that could damage the family honor. The impact of this revelation on the Inquisitor was immediate and visible. His face hardened to the point of being carved from granite, while his fingers tightened over the documents before him. For several minutes, the only sound in the room was the rustling of pages as he feverishly reviewed his previous notes. "Senora Marquise," he finally said in an icy voice, "why didn't you report these allegations at the time?" Catalina had anticipated this crucial question, and her answer had been rehearsed to perfection. "Father, who would have believed the words of a young woman against those of a family as respected as the Santander? Furthermore, Esperanza made me swear on the salvation of my soul that I would not reveal her secret. She told me she would rather die than see her shame exposed publicly." What happened next? Approximately a month after that conversation, Esperanza stopped attending my gatherings. When I sent to inquire about her health, I was informed that she had decided to dedicate her life to the service of God. At that moment, I understood that I had found the only possible way out of her terrible situation. Brother Bernardino closed the file of documents with a sharp movement that echoed in the room like a gunshot. "Madam Marchioness, you will understand that these are accusations of extreme gravity. Incest is one of the most abominable sins in the eyes of God, and if what you relate is true, we will be facing not only a crime against divine law, but also a family conspiracy to hide evidence. I fully understand the gravity of the situation, Father, but my conscience does not allow me to remain silent when an innocent soul has suffered so much." The Inquisitor rose from his chair and began pacing the room with his hands clasped behind his back. It was evident that his mind was working feverishly, assessing the political and religious implications of proceeding with a formal investigation against one of the Viceroyalty's most powerful families. "Is there anything else you consider relevant to this investigation?" he finally asked. Catalina had been waiting for this question, and it was precisely here that she would introduce the element that would turn her testimony from a simple accusation into a time bomb that would completely destroy her enemies. "There is something else, Father, although I am not entirely certain of its relevance." "Go on." "Over the past few months, I have noticed that several of my servants have been discreetly contacted by emissaries of House Santander, not with job offers, but with very specific questions about my activities, my visitors, my correspondence." The Inquisitor suddenly stopped in his pacing. "Are you suggesting that the Santander family is spying on her?" "I dare not make direct accusations, Father. I can only report facts. But it seems strange to me that a respectable family would have so much interest in the private life of a widow who primarily dedicates herself to prayer and charity." This final remark planted the seed Catherine needed if the Santanders were indeed investigating her private activities. Any subsequent discovery about her pregnancy could be presented as part of a smear campaign orchestrated by a family desperate to divert attention from its own crimes. The meeting concluded with the Inquisitor's promise that her testimony would be carefully evaluated, and that she could be called to testify again if new evidence emerged. As she left the shadowy corridors of the Holy Office Tribunal, Catherine knew she had succeeded in planting the first seeds of destruction for her enemies. But what satisfied her most was the understanding that, paradoxically, every month that passed without her being able to hide her pregnancy would strengthen the narrative she had begun to construct. When it finally became impossible to disguise her condition, any accusations from the Santanders about her immorality would sound exactly like what she had suggested. A desperate attempt by a criminal family to tarnish the reputation of the only person who had had the courage to testify against them. That evening, while dining alone in the grand dining room of her mansion, Catalina contemplated her reflection in the silver candlesticks and smiled for the first time in weeks. The game had begun, and she held all the winning cards. The weeks that followed Catalina's testimony transformed Lima into a hotbed of rumor and speculation. The Holy Office had quietly launched a preliminary investigation into the accusations against the Santanders. But in a city where secrets had the shelf life of tropical flowers, it was impossible to keep such proceedings completely secret. Whispers ran from aristocratic salons to popular markets, creating an atmosphere of tension that seemed to thicken the very air of the viceregal capital. Don Rodrigo de Santander, patriarch of the accused family, was not a man willing to remain passive while his lineage was attacked. For more than 40 years, he had built his empire on the basis of absolute control of information and the careful manipulation of political loyalties. Now, faced with the most serious threat he had ever experienced, he decided to use every resource at his disposal to neutralize the person he considered the source of his problems, Catherine of Villanueva. The first sign that the Santanders had begun their counteroffensive came in the form of an unexpected visitor. It was a Tuesday afternoon as the February sun fell slantingly over the courtyards of the Villanueva mansion when Tomás hurried to Catherine's study with an alarmed expression. "Madame Marquise," he announced in a tense voice. "Don Fernando de Santander requests an immediate audience. He is accompanied by a notary and 2 witnesses." Catherine looked up from the prayer book she had been reading, a barely perceptible smile curving the corners of her lips. She had been expecting this move for days. "Show him to the main hall, Tomás, and make sure Maria del Carmen and Rosa are present to serve tea. I want witnesses to our conversation." Don Fernando de Santander, the Count's eldest son and judge of the royal court, was a man in his 40s, whose imposing physical presence had been carefully cultivated to intimidate in the courts of law. His angular face, dominated by gray eyes that seemed to constantly assess the weaknesses of his interlocutors, had hardened even further during the recent weeks of family tension. When he entered the main hall of the Villanueva mansion, his movements carried the calculated precision of a predator who has identified its prey. "Madame Marchioness," he said with a bow that was technically correct, but devoid of any warmth, "I appreciate you receiving me under such delicate circumstances." Catalina had dressed for this occasion in a navy blue velvet suit that enhanced her pallor and gave her an air of fragility that contrasted deliberately with the barely contained aggression of her visitor. She had pulled her hair back into a low bun that revealed the elegant line of her neck, and had chosen understated jewelry that projected wealth without ostentation. "Don Fernando, it is always a pleasure to receive a member of such a distinguished family. Please sit. May I offer you some refreshments?" The tea ritual provided several minutes of forced courtesy, during which both adversaries studied each other like fencers assessing their opponent's defenses before the first attack. Catalina immediately noticed that Fernando had brought with him a small bundle of documents, which confirmed her suspicions about the purpose of the visit. "Marchioness," Fernando began once the maids had withdrawn, "I have come to speak with you concerning a matter that deeply affects the honor of my family." "Of course, Don Fernando, I am at your complete disposal. A few weeks ago, you testified before the Holy Office regarding certain incidents allegedly involving my brother, Carlos, and my sister, Esperanza." Catalina bowed her head slightly, maintaining an expression of appropriate gravity. "Indeed, as a Christian citizen, I considered it my duty to answer truthfully the questions put to me." Fernando leaned forward, boring his gray eyes into Catalina's serene face. "The problem, Your Excellency, is that we have conducted our own investigation into the allegations you presented and have discovered inconsistencies." "What kind of inconsistencies?" Fernando opened his file of documents and extracted a sheet of vellum paper that he immediately recognized for its superior quality. "For example, you stated that my sister Esperanza regularly attended literary gatherings at your home. However, we have consulted the records of Don Sebastian de la Torre, who keeps the social calendar of Lima's leading families, and there is no record of such events at his residence during the months in question." Catalina had anticipated this line of attack and had carefully prepared her response. "Don Fernando, I fear there is a misunderstanding. The meetings I refer to were not formal social events, but rather small congregations of ladies interested in mystical literature. They rarely exceeded 5 or 6 participants and were held in the privacy of my private chambers. Can you provide the names of other participants who can corroborate my sister's attendance?" "Naturally," Catalina responded without hesitation. "Doña Isabel de Avendaño, Doña Carmen de Figueroa and Doña Leonor de Montalvo can confirm Esperanza's regular participation in our discussions. What Fernando didn't know was that the three ladies mentioned by Catalina had been carefully prepared during the previous weeks. Each had received a specific version of events that, without being completely false, created a framework of verisimilitude that would be practically impossible to refute. Fernando consulted another page of his documents. We have also investigated your allegations regarding the alleged bruises my sister had exhibited, according to our family physician, Dr. Ray Bartolome Nunez. He examined Esperanza on multiple occasions during the period in question, and there is no medical record of any unexplained injuries. Don Fernando, Catalina responded in a soft but firm voice. I am certain that Dr. Nunez is a competent professional. However, a woman who attempts to hide evidence of abuse rarely presents it to the family doctor she holds responsible for her situation. This response clearly frustrated the visitor, who began to show the first signs of the impatience he had been suppressing. Madame Marquise, I would appreciate it if we could speak more frankly. My family and yours have maintained a commercial rivalry for years, which is public knowledge. It is not possible that this rivalry influenced your decision to bring such serious accusations against us. This was the moment Catalina had been waiting for, the opportunity to introduce the element that would turn this confrontation from defensive to offensive. Don Fernando, I am deeply surprised that you would suggest that I would fabricate such serious accusations for commercial reasons. Such a suggestion not only attacks my personal honor but also implies that I would be willing to perjure myself before the Holy Office. She rose from her chair with a fluid movement that projected offended dignity. Furthermore, I must tell you that I find it very troubling that instead of investigating the accusations against your brother, your family has decided to investigate me. What kind of investigation have you been conducting exactly? Fernando immediately realized he had fallen into a trap, but it was too late to back out. We have simply consulted public sources to verify public sources, Catalina interrupted. Because I have information that emissaries of your family have been asking my servants very specific questions about my private activities, my visitors, my correspondences. Do you consider such activities to fall under the category of inquiries into public sources? Fernando's face hardened into a mask of aristocratic coldness. Madame Marquise, a family has the right to defend itself when attacked with slander. Slander? Catalina repeated, her voice rising slightly. Don Fernando, are you directly accusing me of lying under a religious oath? I hope you are prepared to present concrete evidence to support such a serious allegation. The tension in the room had reached a point where it seemed the air itself might crack. Fernando realized that he had completely underestimated his adversary, and that every move he had made to discredit her had been turned into a weapon against his own family. Of course, I am not making such an accusation. Fernando retreated with evident discomfort. I am simply trying to clarify certain points that seem perfectly clear to me. Catalina interrupted him again. Your family faces serious accusations, and instead of cooperating with the Holy Office's investigation, they have decided to intimidate and harass witnesses. She walked to the window overlooking the street from where she could observe the Santander mansion. I must confess, Don Fernando, that these attempts at intimidation only confirm my worst suspicions about the veracity of the accusations that have been brought against your family. Fernando abruptly rose from his chair, gathering his documents with jerky movements that betrayed his frustration. Madame Marchioness, I hope you are aware of the implications of continuing down this path. Is that a threat, Don Fernando? It's an observation about the consequences that can result when unfounded accusations are made against respectable families. Catalina slowly turned to face him and, for the first time during the entire conversation, allowed a cold smile to appear on her lips. Don Fernando, I assure you that I am not a woman who is easily intimidated, and I suggest you convey to your family that any further attempts at harassment or intimidation will be immediately reported to both the Holy Office and the Viceroy. After Fernando left, evidently in contained anger, Catalina stood by the window for several long minutes observing the activity in the Santander mansion. She could see lights moving from room to room, a sign that an emergency family meeting was taking place. Tomas silently appeared at her side. How did the meeting go? She asked quietly. Exactly as I expected, Catalina replied without taking her eyes off the rival house. Ferdinand came here believing he could intimidate me into retracting my testimony. Instead, he's just provided me with additional evidence that your family is willing to do anything to prevent the truth from coming out. She turned to Tomas with a satisfied expression. More importantly, you've just confirmed that they're so desperate that they're making mistakes, and every mistake they make strengthens our position. That evening, as Catalina drafted a detailed letter to the Inquisitor General reporting the Santander family's attempts at intimidation, she could feel time beginning to work in her favor. Her pregnancy, which had initially seemed like a doom, was now revealing itself to be the perfect element of their long-term strategy. Every week that passed, without her being able to hide her condition, brought her closer to the culminating moment of her revenge. And when that moment arrived, the Santanders would discover that they had completely underestimated the destructive power of a woman who had nothing to lose. If you're enjoying this tale of revenge and intrigue in colonial Lima, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel for more historical mysteries like this one. What do you think of Catherine's strategy so far? Do you think she will succeed in destroying the Santanders, or is there something she's missing? Share your theory in the comments. Now, let's see how the next move unfolds in this dangerous power game. The month of April 1721 brought with it the change of season that transformed Lima into a mosaic of colors that contrasted dramatically with the political storm brewing in its aristocratic salons. Jacaranda trees bloomed in purple along the cobblestone streets, while the air was filled with the sweet scent of orange trees that adorned the colonial courtyards. It was in this seemingly idyllic setting that Catherine of Villanueva prepared to execute the final phase of her elaborate revenge. Her pregnancy had reached the point where it could no longer be completely concealed, even with the loosest dresses and most ingenious corsets. The changes in her figure were subtle but perceptible to a trained eye, and she knew she would soon have to reveal her condition. However, far from worrying her, this reality had been incorporated as a central element of her strategy. On the morning of April 15, Catherine received the news she had been waiting for. The Holy Office had completed its preliminary investigation and had decided to proceed with formal charges against Charles of Santander for the crime of incest. The decision had been communicated through an official message delivered by Captain Mendozas himself, who had visited her house months earlier. Madame Marquise, the officer informed her as he stood in the mansion's foyer, the court requires your presence tomorrow morning for the formal testimony that will be included in the official proceedings. Your statement will be critical to the case being presented against the accused. Catalina received the news with the serene composure that had characterized all of her public appearances over the past few months. But internally, she felt the satisfaction of seeing all the pieces of her plan begin to fall into place with mathematical precision. Captain, I will be present at the requested time. Is there anything specific you need to prepare for my testimony? The Inquisitor General has requested that you bring any correspondence or documentation that might corroborate the details of your relationship with the victim during the period in question. That evening, Catalina met with Tomas in his study to review the documents she had been meticulously preparing for weeks. They were not forgeries, but genuine letters he had exchanged with various ladies of Lima society, carefully selected to create a pattern of circumstantial evidence that would support his testimony. Everything is ready, she told him as she organized the letters into chronological order. Tomorrow morning, Carlos de Santander will be formally accused of incest. Once that happens, the entire family's reputation will be completely destroyed. Tomas, who had watched the plan unfold for months, still seemed impressed by the complexity of the strategy his beloved had devised. What will happen after the trial? Regardless of the outcome, the Santanders will be socially ruined. No respectable family will want to associate with them. Their business alliances will disintegrate, and their properties will lose value as potential buyers avoid them because of the associated scandal. He approached the window from where he could observe the rival mansion, where the lights remained on until the early hours, while the family desperately tried to find a way out of their situation. But that's just the beginning, Tomas. When my pregnancy becomes apparent, as it inevitably will in the coming weeks, any attempt by the Santanders to use it against me will be interpreted as an act of desperate revenge by a criminal family. The brilliance of this strategy lay in its complete inversion of vulnerabilities. What would have been Catalina's downfall under normal circumstances would become further evidence of the depravity of her enemy. And when that happens, she continued in a soft but determined voice, I will present my own accusation against Carlos de Santander. I will allege that he, knowing I was the main witness against him, attempted to seduce me to compromise my testimony, and when I rejected his advances, he raped me. Tomas looked at her with a mixture of admiration and horror at the audacity of what she was proposing. Do you think anyone will believe such an accusation? Who is going to contradict a pregnant woman accusing the same man already on trial for incest, especially when that woman is the main witness against him and when her family has been caught trying to intimidate and harass said witness? The day of the formal testimony dawned gray and damp, with those low clouds that frequently covered Lima during the months of transition. Catherine had carefully chosen her attire, a black silk dress with white lace details that projected sobriety and credibility, complemented by a pearl necklace that had belonged to her late mother. Her hairstyle, tied in an elaborate but conservative bun, gave her an air of maturity and seriousness that effectively contrasted with any attempt to present her as frivolous or immoral. The tribunal of the Holy Office had convened in the main hall of the Santo Domingo convent, an austere space dominated by a monumental crucifix and dark wooden pews where the members of the clergy who would evaluate the evidence sat. Fray Bernardino de Mendoza presided from a raised carved chair, flanked by 4 other inquisitors whose faces reflected the gravity of the proceedings they were about to conduct. Charles of Santander was present as the accused, accompanied by his defense attorney, a pale and nervous man whose task of defending the indefensible was evident in every line of tension on his face. Charles himself had lost considerable weight during the weeks of investigation, and his once arrogant and self-assured face now bore the ravages of fear and despair. When Catherine was called to testify, she approached the witness stand with measured steps that echoed in the silence of the courtroom. Her presence commanded immediate respect, and it was clear that even the most skeptical inquisitors were impressed by her dignity and composure. My lady Marchioness, Fray Bernardino began, for the salvation of your immortal soul, I swear that the testimony you are about to offer is the complete truth and nothing but the truth. I so swear, Father Inquisitor. For the next hour, Catalina meticulously pieced together her relationship with Esperanza de Santander, providing specific details about conversations, dates, and observations that painted a devastating picture of systematic abuse and familial cover-up. Her testimony was presented with such precision and consistency that it was virtually impossible to refute. When it came time to present the letters she had brought as evidence, Catalina submitted them to the court with the solemnity of someone fulfilling a sacred duty. These correspondences, she explained, document my concerns for Esperanza's well-being, as well as my consultations with other ladies of society about the situation I had observed. The letters, written in her elegant handwriting, created a contemporaneous record of events that fully supported her version of events. What the court didn't know was that these letters had been written in the weeks leading up to the testimony, using artificially aged paper and ink prepared to look older. The culminating moment came when Fray Bernardino directly asked about the Santander family's attempts at intimidation. Madam Marchioness, have you experienced pressure or threats related to your testimony in this case? Yes, Father Inquisitor. Don Fernando de Santander visited my house with the explicit intention of persuading me to retract my testimony. When I refused, he threatened me with consequences if I continued down this path. Witnesses witnessed this threat. My butler and 2 of my maids were present for the entire conversation. The impact of this revelation in court was immediate. Threats to witnesses were considered almost as serious as the original crimes and confirmed the image of a family willing to do anything to avoid justice. When Carlos de Santander was called to defend himself, his testimony proved disastrous, nervous, contradictory, and clearly desperate. It only reinforced the impression of guilt that Catalina's testimony had created. His attempts to deny the accusations rang hollow in the face of the meticulously presented evidence, and his allegations that Catalina was motivated by business rivalry were easily refuted by the consistency and detail of her testimony. The verdict, when it was finally delivered 3 hours later, was devastating for the Santander family. Carlos was found guilty of incest and sentenced to 10 years of confinement in a remote monastery in the mountains with a perpetual ban on returning to Lima. But more importantly, the court issued a public condemnation of the entire family for their attempt to cover up the crime and threaten witnesses. That night, as the bells of every church in Lima announced the verdict according to tradition, Catalina was in her study, drafting letters to her business and political ally. The destruction of the Santanders had created a power vacuum that she was perfectly positioned to fill. "How are you feeling?" Tomas asked her as he watched her write in the golden light of the chandeliers. Catalina looked up from her correspondence and looked at him with an expression that mixed satisfaction and determination. Like a woman who has just secured the future of her child, she responded by placing a protective hand on her belly, which already showed the unmistakable curvature of the new life that was growing inside her. "The Santanders have fallen, Tomas, and when our son is born, he will inherit not only my fortune, but also everything they have lost." What Catalina could not anticipate was that her victory, so carefully orchestrated, would have consequences that would extend far beyond her original intentions, creating ripples that would alter the balance of power in Lima for generations to come. The months that followed Carlos de Santander's trial transformed Lima into a city that seemed to have awakened from a long slumber. The fall of a family as powerful as the Santanders sent shockwaves that spread from aristocratic salons to popular markets, redistributing alliances, fortunes, and loyalties in ways no one had fully anticipated. Catalina de Villanueva, now 6 months pregnant, had emerged as the most influential figure in Lima society. Her testimony against the Santanders had not only been vindicated by the court's verdict, but had been elevated to the status of a heroic act by a society that had begun to view her intervention as liberation from years of tyranny. Covert. The Santander mansion, which for decades had been the nerve center of economic and political power in Lima, now stood partially empty. Don Rodrigo, the patriarch, had suffered a stroke just weeks after the verdict and was partially paralyzed, while Fernando had been quietly transferred to a minor administrative post in a remote province of the Viceroyalty. The family had begun selling off their properties at reduced prices, desperate to generate cash to pay legal debts and maintain some vestige of their former lifestyle. Catalina had strategically acquired several of these properties through intermediaries, consolidating a business empire that now stretched from the silver mines of Potosi to the shipyards of Callao. But her most significant victory had been the acquisition of the San Marcos sugar estate, the Santander's most lucrative property, which she had obtained for less than half its actual value. Catalina's pregnancy, when it finally became public in May, was met with a completely different reaction than the one would have experienced under normal circumstances. Instead of scandal and condemnation, she found understanding and support. The narrative she had carefully constructed over months had worked perfectly. She was seen as a victim who had been targeted by a family desperate to silence her truthful testimony. The official version of events circulating in the salons and markets of Lima was that Charles of Santander had attempted to seduce Catherine to compromise her testimony, and when she had rejected his advances, he had resorted to violence. This story not only explained her pregnancy, but also added an extra layer of villainy to a man who had already been convicted of incest. Thomas, whose true paternity remained Lima's best-kept secret, had been officially manumitted by Catherine and had become her chief administrator. His intelligence and loyalty, which had previously been limited by his status as a slave, now flourished in an environment where he could exercise real authority over an ever-expanding commercial empire. The manumission ceremony had been a public event carefully designed by Catherine to send a clear message about her values and priorities. Presence of notaries, witnesses, and representatives of the vice-regal authorities had declared that Tomas's freedom was recognition of his exceptional loyalty during the difficult months surrounding the Santander trial. A man who has demonstrated such dedication and competence deserves more than chains, he had declared during the ceremony. He deserves the opportunity to shape his own destiny. What observers interpreted as a magnanimous gesture from a benevolent lady toward a faithful servant was actually the first step toward the social legitimization of a relationship that would soon take a completely different form. In August 1721, when Catherine's pregnancy had reached its final stages, she announced her intention to marry Tomás de Villanueva, as he was now officially called. The news initially caused a stir in Lima society, but the opposition, which would have been fierce under normal circumstances, was mitigated by several factors that Catherine had carefully calculated. First, Tomás was no longer a slave, but a free man with substantial property that Catherine had discreetly transferred to him during the previous months. Second, his education and refinement clearly distinguished him from society's typical image of Africans. Third, and most importantly, Catherine had carefully cultivated the narrative that this marriage was an act of Christian redemption. She was providing a name and a father to the child who had been conceived through violence. The wedding took place in the Villanueva mansion's private chapel one September morning with an intimate ceremony that included only Catalina's closest friends and a few representatives of the church. Father Sebastian Montoya, a progressive Jesuit who had been carefully selected for his liberal views on racial issues, officiated the ceremony with a homily on redemption and forgiveness. "In this world where sin and evil sometimes prevail," he declared during the ceremony, "we see here an example of how Christian virtue can transform tragedy into blessing, despair into hope." Catalina and Tomás's son was born in October 1721 on a night of torrential rain reminiscent of the storm during which this whole story had begun. He was a light-complexioned boy who showed no obvious signs of his African heritage, which would greatly facilitate his acceptance into colonial society. He was baptized Rodrigo de Villanueva, a name deliberately chosen as a final insult to the fallen family. The very name of the Santander patriarch would now identify the heir to his greatest enemy. Over the following years, the Villanueva family consolidated its position as the most powerful in Lima. Catalina had demonstrated such commercial and political acumen that even those who had initially questioned her marriage were forced to acknowledge her success. Tomás, meanwhile, had become one of the Viceroyalty's most respected merchants, establishing trade routes that stretched to Spain and the Asian colonies. The mansion, which had once harbored the secrets and fears of a pregnant Marchioness, now echoed with the laughter of a child growing up unaware of the extraordinary circumstances of his conception. Rodrigo de Villanueva developed into an intelligent and charismatic young man who combined his mother's business acumen with his father's physical strength and determination. In 1725, 4 years after the trial that had changed everything, Catalina found herself in her study reviewing the account books that showed the full extent of her commercial empire. The properties that had once belonged to the Santanders now formed the core of a fortune that rivaled that of any family in the New World. Tomás entered the room silently, carrying Rodrigo, now 3.5 years old, who had developed a habit of helping his parents with their work, reviewing documents with the comical seriousness of a miniature adult. "How are the accounts coming along?" Tomás asked as the boy settled onto his mother's lap. "Better than I ever imagined," Catalina replied, looking at her son with a mixture of maternal love and satisfaction at the fulfillment of a long-considered plan. "The investments in the new trade routes have generated returns of 300%, and the properties we acquired from the Santanders have tripled in value." She walked toward the window, from where she could look out over the old Santander mansion, which had now been converted into a school for orphans that she had founded and personally financed. It was an ironic gesture that gave her daily satisfaction. The house that had once housed their most powerful enemies now served as a monument to their complete victory. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if we had chosen a different path?" Tomás asked her as he took in the same view. Catalina considered the question for a moment, but her answer was immediate and without hesitation. "There is no room for regret in my heart, Tomás. What we did was necessary to protect our son and secure his future. The Santanders weren't simply business rivals. They were predators who destroyed lives to maintain their power. She lifted Rodrigo in her arms and held him to the window so he could see the school operating in the building across the street. Our son will grow up in a world where merit and virtue matter more than lineage and inherited privileges. That is a legacy worth any price we've had to pay. That night, while all of Lima slept, under the blanket of stars shining over the Pacific, Catalina de Villanueva lay in her bedroom reflecting on the extraordinary path she had traveled since that stormy night when she discovered her pregnancy. In less than 4 years, she had transformed what would have been her social ruin into the foundation of a power that extended far beyond the borders of the viceroyalty. The story of the Marchioness, who had destroyed the most powerful family in Lima using only her ingenuity and determination, had become legend. But what very few knew was that behind every calculated move, every strategic alliance, every decision she had made, there had always been love for a man whose skin color would have made their union impossible under normal circumstances, and the determination that her son would grow up free from the limitations that colonial society imposed on those not born in the right circumstances. In the archives of the convent of Santa Catalina, the document the nuns called the Cursed Paper remained locked away, containing the true version of events that had forever changed the balance of power in the capital of Spain's richest viceroyalty. But that truth, like so many other secrets of the colonial era, was destined to remain hidden, protecting the reputation of a family that had managed to rewrite not only its own destiny, but also the very rules of the game everyone was forced to play. Catherine of Villanueva's revenge had been complete, but more than that, it had been transformative. In a world where power was inherited and social standing was determined by birth, she had proven that intelligence, determination, and the capacity for sacrifice could overcome any obstacle. Her story would become a secret inspiration for generations of women who would face their own battles against a system designed to limit them. And in Lima in 1725, while little Rodrigo de Villanueva played in the courtyards of the city's largest mansion, few could have imagined they were witnessing the birth of a dynasty that would dominate South American commerce for the next 2 centuries. Built on the foundations of a revenge so perfect that it transformed despair into triumph and scandal into legend. This mystery shows us how true power does not always reside in inherited titles or brute force, but in the ability to transform the most desperate circumstances into opportunities for victory. What do you think of Catalina's story? Do you think her revenge was justified, or are there aspects of her strategy that seem too calculated? Leave your comment below and tell us if you know of other historical cases where someone managed to completely reverse their situation through strategic planning. If you enjoyed this tale of intrigue and revenge in colonial Lima, subscribe to the channel, activate the bell, and share it with someone who loves historical mysteries. See you in the next video with more hidden secrets of Latin America.